we have this beautiful Sankey diagram, right, with all the flows going to different directions from sources, instruments, sectors, and geographies. And we present this to policymakers, right? So I would like to ask you, when we present this to the policymakers, what insights do we expect them to get?
Yeah, and I love that work again. As you said, one of the first products actually that we launched at CPI at the very beginning of our journey. I still call it the spaghetti graph, by the way, because it was born in Italy, one of our first offices. And it shows you very nicely, as you say, how climate finance evolves along the basically value chain from sources to the very end of end users.
So where are we today then? What's the number? What's the big number today?
Drum rolls. I always love the number. So I think, we just published a couple of months ago our latest figures, which show that global climate finance, which is public and private, domestic and international, has reached the 1.9 trillion US dollars amount. And that has been actually increasing a lot. It's doubled over the last 6 years, which obviously is good news. And I think there's a few good news, and then I think a few very good lessons on what needs to be done in order to continue that journey.
Okay, so beyond these numbers and the famous Sankey, of course, is there something, the most important key takeaway that for governments and financial actors that you would like to convey?
Data matters.
Data matters.
What you can't measure, you can't manage. You need to have transparency. You need to have data.
Halo cendekia iklim, selamat datang kembali di EKONIKLIM Podcast bersama saya Ira Purnomo. EKONIKLIM adalah sebuah program oleh Climate Policy Initiative di mana kita bicara mengenai pembiayaan iklim, transisi energi, dan juga kaitannya dengan ekonomi dan keuangan. Pada episode hari ini, kita kedatangan tamu yang sangat spesial langsung dari San Francisco. Beliau akan bicara tentang perspektif global mengenai pembiayaan iklim dan juga mengkaitkannya dengan konteks di Indonesia. Istilah seperti climate finance, innovative finance, dan juga carbon market sudah sering kita dengar ya. Tapi pertanyaannya, bagaimana Indonesia bisa benar-benar memobilisasi pembiayaan dalam skala besar dan tetap menjaga stabilitas ekonomi dan memastikan bahwa manfaatnya bisa dirasakan oleh masyarakat? So to learn from all these global perspectives and understand Indonesia's position, today we are very honored to have Barbara Buchner, a leading global voice in climate finance and Global Managing Director of Climate Policy Initiative, here with us. Barbara has helped shape many of the most influential climate finance initiatives, including the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance and the Global Landscape of Climate Finance. Her work has guided billions in investment towards sustainable development and supported countries like Indonesia in advancing their climate goals. Hi, Barbara. How are you today?
Very good. So nice to be here. Thanks so much, Ira.
Yes, so we are really thrilled to have you here in our studio, and thank you so much for your time for this podcast. How has it been so far for your trip in Indonesia?
Been a great week, more than a week actually. I feel I've learned a lot, and it's been great to see the whole team here at CPI. We've been growing, as you know, so it's been very nice to get to know everyone and just learn what's going on here in Indonesia and in the region.
Yeah, it has indeed. It has been growing, and yes, I'm happy to know that you have learned a lot of what's going on in Indonesia, especially with Indonesia's energy transition and all the progress that we're going through. So that's really great. So maybe to start our conversation today, I would like to start with CPI's flagship program, which is the Global Landscape of Climate Finance. So this is a flagship work where we track climate finance, right, from different sources, through different instruments, and also going through different sectors and also to different geographies. We have this beautiful Sankey diagram, right, with all the flows going to different directions from sources, instruments, sectors, and geographies. And we present this to policymakers, right? So I would like to ask you, when we present this to the policymakers, what insights do we expect them to get?
Yeah, and I love that work again. As you said, one of the first products actually that we launched at CPI at the very beginning of our journey. I still call it the spaghetti graph, by the way, because it was born in Italy, one of our first offices. And it shows you very nicely, as you say, how climate finance evolves along the basically value chain from sources to the very end of end users. What do policymakers look for, and how can we help them guide their work through this flagship report? Well, I think the landscape shows, the spaghetti shows where money is going and where money isn't going. So it shows you who is behind the money, who are the actors, the sources, public and private, what's the types of instruments that are being used, and where does it end up, basically, so in terms of end users. And so it gives you a very good understanding of where are the gaps and what policymakers need to prioritize in order to also unlock some of the pools of capital that are not yet, let's say, in the game or not yet engaged into climate action. So it gives you a very good basis to understand where we are today and what we need to do in order to fill the gaps and get basically to the needs that are out there.
I see. So where are we today then? What's the number? What's the big number today?
Drum rolls. I always love the number. So I think, we just published a couple of months ago our latest figures, which show that global climate finance, which is public and private, domestic and international, has reached the 1.9 trillion US dollars amount. And that has been actually increasing a lot. It's doubled over the last 6 years, which obviously is good news. And I think there's a few good news, and then I think a few very good lessons on what needs to be done in order to continue that journey.
Wow, that's amazing. $1.9 trillion, and it has doubled over the last few years. That's great. So is this, are we already in a good position? Is this already a good number, or is it not enough? What do you think?
Well, I think, again, let's celebrate the good news. It is a good number. We have seen a very good trend over the last years. And if the trend were to continue, we would be able to actually close the gap. So get to let's say, the lowest bound of estimated needs within a few years, by 2028, actually. So 6 trillion is the lowest bound of different scenarios of what are the needs globally on climate action. But at the same time, obviously, that will require very strong policies and continued capital into this space. So while it's a good trend, it's a good number, we still need at least 3 times as much as we have today in order to really get us on a low-carbon, climate-resilient pathway.
I see. That's incredible. We have doubled already. I think we can triple it. I'm optimistic.
Go for it.
Yes. And what are the concentrations of all this climate finance going?
Yes. So again, good news first, and then let me go to some of the certainly the areas that need more attention. Good news: for the first time, private climate finance has actually crossed the 1 trillion threshold, and that is for the first time there's more private climate finance than public climate finance for global climate action. And that again does show you that there is maturing technologies, that the market is maturing, that there are sectors and geographies and technologies that are commercially viable. So that is good news. But if you then take a step back and look at the broader concentrations, as you said, I think what concerns me is first that most of the global climate finance is still focused on mitigation, energy, transport, buildings. So it's actually more than 90% of global climate finance goes to mitigation. Only a few percent, a small share of global climate finance goes towards adaptation and resilience. So that is something that certainly needs to be addressed, and where we need policy levers to unlock more capital. And then the second concentration that worries me is while we have seen a good trend in terms of international kind of transfers from global developed countries to developing and emerging economies. There has been increases, but still out of the 1.9 trillion, only 200 billion today is going towards from the global north to the global south. So again, something that needs to be addressed for sure to ensure that the needs are being met. The one additional point I'd like actually to make, because I think it comes back also in some of the other trends, I'd love to go deeper a little later, is one of the insights that we have and it's been actually emerging over the last years of our work, is that most of climate finance is raised and spent in the same country. So domestic capital is extremely important. So the 200 billion that I'm mentioning is not yet including some of the domestic capital that is being mobilized in all countries, and very importantly in emerging economies by domestic sources, both public and private. But still, more needs to go towards emerging economies.
I see, I understand. And how about the ratio between public and private financing? Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes, so again, I think good news that the private part now is actually a little larger than the public part. So we have the 1 trillion threshold that has been crossed by private finance. But at the same time, we are a little concerned about trends in the public finance situation, let's say. The latest figures which we have, which are coming from before some of the more recent announcements and developments around development aid, have shown that public finance has decreased over the last years in our latest figures. So certainly something to kind of take a step back and understand how can we make sure that both public and private go really hand in hand, and public finance, most importantly, is being used to unlock private capital and other pools of domestic capital.
How about sources of capital, like between equity and debt financing? Can you tell us a little bit more about that as well?
Yes, still the majority is still debt instruments, which I think is also concerning, particularly in emerging economies, given the situation there. So I think there is, for me, again, a new opportunity also to think about how can we use more equity instruments, how can catalytic equity be used to really unlock more and mobilize more other pools of capital again. So I think that's something certainly we're keeping a very close eye on.
So, beyond these numbers and the famous M key, of course, is there something, the most important key takeaway that for governments and financial actors that you would like to convey?
Data matters.
Data matters.
What you can't measure, you can't manage. You need to have transparency. You need to have data. So we've been at CPI working since more than a decade on tracking climate finance. We've been trying to help improve the quality of the global climate finance landscape, the sources of data providers, the ways of comparing different types of data. So I think more focus on data, providing the right information, making it accessible, and really increasing the transparency of data and the accountability ultimately is really important. So what you can't measure, you can't manage.
I like that. What you can't measure, you can't manage.
It's actually not mine. It's actually Mike Bloomberg has said that. So, but still, we're all using it.
Yeah,
I think it's really
totally
important.
Agree. All right. So let's move a little bit more into the developing countries now. So what are the typical patterns in the climate finance landscape that you often see in developing economies? Like, is Indonesia different in that sense? For example, do they depend heavily on concessional finance, or do they have specific sectors that dominate?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think there's a few general trends that we see, general patterns that we see. Certainly, there is continued needs. I think the needs are always higher than the availability of climate finance for developing countries. But at the same time, what we see is that the money is out there. I think what we need to be very clear about, it's not a question about there is no money, there is no capital. If you just look at domestic savings, institutional markets out there, there is a lot of capital. It's sometimes in the wrong uses. So I think there is very clearly what we see is that very often money is in fossil fuel subsidies.
Somewhere else, right?
Somewhere else. So we need to think about how can we shift capital towards climate action. And I think that's something that we certainly see, not only in developing countries. I think it's something that we see globally. But yeah, I think needs versus availability, so that the requests and not enough money, but then at the same time, this clarity that there is money. I think the point I already made, the importance of domestic capital and therefore of regulation. We see that across developing countries that have managed to kind of increase more the climate action, regulation is really important. So having a strong enabling environment It's been just really important to build basically the basis for investors to come in. So really thinking about what are, the policies that we can learn from, that we can replicate, that really have created more of the certainty in the market. And I think just beyond the policies, for me, it is really but domestic resource mobilization. We've seen a very strong role of development finance institutions, a very strong role of national development banks, of subnational development banks, of public development banks. So I think that is certainly a common pattern that we see a very high share of the finance that is being raised and distributed by these banks. And I think they certainly can help bring more of the needed finance to developing countries. Certainly there's some bottlenecks. I think there are around project preparation, they're around, particularly if you talk about international climate finance going to emerging markets, there is limited local currency solutions. So there's certainly a number of bottlenecks, but at the same time, I think there is some clear patterns that hold also for Indonesia, by the way. I think Indonesia, what is a little different in Indonesia, which I think is exciting, is that there is a focus on carbon pricing, so this maturing carbon pricing framework, which I think is very interesting. I also see, and again, I've been learning particularly this week, about very large nature and just transition opportunities. I mean, there's a vast opportunity, potential for renewable energy, which I think is incredibly exciting. And then I think also there is a strong pipeline, actually, which comes back to the how can we make sure that the money that's out there actually goes to the HES projects to invest in. And I see here in Indonesia certainly a very strong pipeline of renewable projects, but also of the grid, which I think is the basis to really scale up.
Great. I love your answers. I mean, I really like the fact that I really like the fact that the money is out there. It's just kind of trapped for non-climate priorities, right? And for Indonesia itself, we do have a lot of potential, as you have said before. We have a maturing carbon pricing framework, just transition going on, and then a vast potential of renewable energy, right? So that's really great. So now I would like to learn a little bit more from developed countries. So when pushing for more climate finance, what lessons, both positive and negative, from the developed countries can the Indonesian policymakers learn? For example, what worked in the US or Europe that could be adapted to Indonesia's context? Or what should Indonesia avoid?
Yeah, I think there's certainly some good lessons, even though I have to say also developed countries need to continue to learn. And also it's not always a one-on-one lessons. I think every country context really matters. But I think there's some broader lessons that we can certainly draw. I think the most importantly is the key role of certainty, of predictability, of credibility. So having very clear targets, having independent oversight, having very good planning, predictable regulation, something that gives really certainty to the market, to investors, I think is key. And that's certainly something that we have seen from particularly, lots of lessons both in Europe, but also in North America on that one. So I think certainly in policy credibility is key. I think the second lesson, which is something which is evolving, we haven't fully executed on it yet, but I think it's certainly evolving, is that you need to use public money, which continues to be scarce, and that's normal. That's not, that's not like endless pockets of public money. They need to use public money most effectively to address market barriers and risks in the market. So we should not use public money to crowd out, other pools of capital. Where the market is ready for private investors, that should be encouraged. So we really need to use public money to address risks that are still out there, to address sectors like adaptation, where we need more money. And then I think the third lesson, what I certainly have seen, and which I see already being applied also to emerging economies, is that coordination within countries of the different parts of stakeholders is really important. So you can have national platforms, you can sectoral platforms, but really using the whole ecosystem of actors in the country will ensure that there is alignment across those actors, and ultimately will accelerate the time to get to climate action on the ground.
See. And when you talked previously about public finance, I think this is also a good thing because it cannot replace private capital, right? But we can actually blend public and private capital, right? Through blended finance. Could you tell us a little bit more about that and the opportunity it can bring?
Oh, absolutely. No, I think particularly in these times where also private investors still need to learn about the new opportunities. It's a lot about raising awareness, about showing that there are solutions out there, that there are opportunities to invest, business cases out there. But in order to make sure that that is kind of a common knowledge and that investors are really ready to scale their engagement, very often you need to address risks that they feel they cannot take on yet. So this is where public money, this is where blended finance comes in, really using public money to address some of the risks that private investors feel they can't take on yet. They're not yet ready. They don't understand the country. They don't understand, basically the specific technology. It's outside, let's say, of the traditional technologies that they've been dealing with. So this is where, you can think about bringing public money in, blended with, within financial structures that then can really help to unlock private capital. So I think it's a really important piece of getting us to the scale that is needed and of really making the private investors more comfortable. So not fully taking all the risk off because you want to have skin in the game by private investors, but really making sure that you help them ease into the space.
I see, especially when the public, when the private sector are more risk averse. We need more public finance to address the risk, for example, for de-risking instruments such as guarantees, and this can bring more confidence to the private financiers, right? Okay. Now let's talk about a trending topic in Indonesia, which is the carbon market.
I love the carbon market.
Yeah, so Indonesia is so far the only ASEAN country doing a domestic carbon market, whereas the EU's emission trading scheme has been running for almost 2 decades and has gone through so many reform cycles, as I've heard. So from your perspectives, what lessons can Indonesia learn from the EU's ETS, both in terms of early mistakes and also eventual successes?
Absolutely, and I've been smiling because 2 decades, so I've been actually helping at the very beginning to set up the EU ETS. I mean, we've been like with our own, more obviously as always on the analytical side, but at that point we actually have been learning from the earliest emissions trading markets, which were in the US around SO2 sulfur trading. So that's where we have been learning. Anyway, coming back to Europe, lots of very helpful lessons, I feel. Certainly in terms of, the basis, how you allocate emission permits to the involved entities. So I think one of the lessons that certainly we have learned in Europe is that while we started with, it's called grandfathering, where you give out permits for free, which is not always creating the right incentives for the companies that are involved to actually realize that this permit has a value. So it's been gradually moving towards auctioning, which I think was the right move. But I think it's certainly, if you start a new system, it does make sense to kind of get started with a clear allocation and then highlight that you're moving towards other ways of allocating this permits over time, which is auctioning. So I think the importance of basically the supply, which are the permits, is important. But then at the demand, is really important. But then the supply. So I think the emissions cap. So how you define and evolve the emissions cap, which again is the basis for emissions trading system, is really important. So publishing a very transparent emissions cap trajectory. So again, investors, companies can prepare for what is going to happen, I think is another second very important lessons that we have. And I think maybe the third one, that this is a new revenue stream. This is very good because, again, we need to increase more money, but it also, emissions trading also gives the right incentives to be more efficient in your use of energy and other activities. So the revenues that you get through the emissions trading system should be reinvested, making sure that it stays in the in the country. You can do it for just transition. I mean, in Indonesia, you can do it, for grid modernization, upgrades. So, but really making sure that this is not just like another pot of money that goes somewhere, but really is like, earmarked for the country in order to make sure that it's supporting this acceleration towards a just and resilient energy transition. I think is what. So ultimately, it's about having predictability as you are tightening the cap, the goal, let's say. And it's about what I said also before, transparency. I think having very clear, transparent rules will help establish the confidence in the market and will attract investors.
I see. And I really agree with the revenue that should be reinvested, earmarked for all the climate actions, right? And then I have a question about, since Indonesia's carbon market is quite new, so do you think we should prioritize high carbon prices or focus more on building participation and trust first?
For me, it is, you will get to the high carbon prices, but I think you need first to have certainly a lesson from Europe, you need to have the infrastructure, the capacity in place. So I think you need to really build the participation. You need to show that this is a good thing for you to be part of this. This can create like savings for yourself that can make your production more efficient. So I think it's really important to build the basis of the system, get the buy-in from participants, and the trust in the system that is going to evolve. And that all will then lead to higher carbon prices. Maybe just link to that. It will be, if you think about higher carbon prices, it will be important to standardize also some of the, or align, not standardize, align with some of the international standards that are evolving in terms of carbon standards, because I think that will help Indonesia just more easily kind of also be aligned or link with other initiatives, or be prepared when there's some potential border adjustment measures that might evolve.
Yeah, well noted. So infrastructure first, and then high prices will come along.
That's the cap.
Awesome. Yes.
Tighten the cap.
I see. A little bit more about Indonesia. As you know, we are an archipelago. We have 17,000 islands, and I believe this will pose some challenges in terms of infrastructure, logistics. But what does it mean in terms of climate finance?
Just again, I'm still learning 17,000 islands, which is
More
obviously, this is like logistic and infrastructure needs are immense. So that means high cost of transmission. It means also, high cost of distribution for renewable energy. It's, very hard to achieve economies of scale, particularly for small islands. I think what that means that, again, the importance of adaptation finance, also to address some of the needs, particularly in coastal areas, which we already all see that, we can witness lots of the impacts that are already happening. But again, trying to be positive, it also shows a lot of opportunities for decentralized solutions, and opportunities to really think about tailored solutions that can work. And so I feel like there is a number of lessons again, and there's obviously also in the region lots of thinking going on how can you address the challenges here. So I think there is a number of opportunities, including again local currency lending for some of the distributed solar technologies, but also for efficiency technologies. I think there's solutions like resilience bonds that can help aggregate, and particularly when you think about like lots of small islands, you got to think about how can you bundle and aggregate it, kind of come to bigger projects or financial instruments that can attract investor attention. So it is about bonds as well for potential for coastal protection or something similar. And I think also some of the lessons that we see from other geographies that are having similar challenges, I think, is around results-based payments. So really thinking about if you want to restore or maintain nature, what are some of the opportunities for results-based mechanisms that can help to address the specific issues that Indonesia is dealing with.
I see, I see. So due to our geographic condition, this means actually that we have a good opportunity for adaptation finance. I mean, as we have seen before from the global landscape, adaptation is quite small, less than 20%. But here in Indonesia, apparently there is a huge opportunity, right?
Huge opportunity, absolutely. And I mean, this is something, again, where Indonesia certainly can lead. And there has been a lot of actually work going on, but I feel it's time to scale and think about how can you really do more, because I think with the specific geographic setting that you have here, I think this is an area that Indonesia really can show leadership.
Yes, definitely. And also due to the small islands, decentralized systems or off-grid systems is also can also bring a huge opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Now let's talk about the buzz around innovative finance. So people have recently liked to talk about innovative climate financing mechanisms, but how do we know that a mechanism is innovative and not just like a repackaging or renaming of something that already existed?
Oh, I tell you, again, I feel like a little bit of guilt for this whole buzz. We have started, you mentioned it briefly at the beginning, we have started the Global Innovation Lab for Climate Finance in 2014, when we all thought, like, we need innovation, everything is, we need everything new. I think we've learned a lot over these 10 plus years. I think innovation is not necessarily new. It is about the definition. It is about applying maybe even an established instrument, but to an area that it's not yet being used at. So it is ultimately about addressing a barrier, a real barrier, in a more efficient way, a market barrier, whatever is out there, and therefore mobilizing capital. It is about reducing or managing real or perceived risk more efficiently, or addressing the risks that have possibly not been addressed in the past. Again, do bring in private capital a little bit to the blended finance point that we have been making before. And I think that the other lesson that we're seeing is why you need innovation still in some of the areas that are really where there is not a lot of experience. There are no good best practices. There's no case studies. The harder sectors, the harder geographies, adaptation again is still in that area, even though we continue to see some instruments that can bring scale. But I think you need like a balance between more innovative, still a little bit complexer financial instrument, and then really those that will really survive are those that are replicable and scalable. So I think you need to test and demonstrate for areas that are earlier stage that just don't have yet the experience, the knowledge base. But then ultimately a really successful innovative financial instrument should be one that can be replicated in other geographies, in other sectors, and can really help getting us to scale.
I see, that's very clear. So innovative doesn't have to be new, but it has to bring some new perspectives, or it can be applied in an area that hasn't been applied before. And most importantly, it needs to scale, right? And it needs to be replicable. I see. So maybe if there is any particular innovative mechanism that you would like to highlight, that you really like right now or is really successful, maybe you can take a little bit from the Global Innovation Lab of Climate Finance. There's something you would like to highlight maybe?
So hard. We have like more than 70 now. I could talk about that for hours. I will not. I will pick
70 instruments?
Yes,
Wow.
more than, again, and mobilized more than almost $4.5 billion US for emerging markets only. So I think this is, again, a very good track record that we've built up. But let me maybe, out of our really good lab portfolio, and I suggest if people are interested, we have a great website. So there's much more information, also like good briefs on successes and lessons from our 10 plus years. So have a look at that. But maybe the one I'd like to highlight, also because it actually has relevance for Indonesia, is Climate Investor One, which was one of our first ones actually that we helped launch, which is a mechanism that actually tries to simplify and combine various facilities in a way to reduce the transaction cost for investors. So it is bundling three facilities. It's a project preparation facility, with a construction facility, with a refinance facility. In this way, you simplify, there is like one fund manager is like overseeing those, and you simplify for investors that come in at different stages what needs to happen. And you also build confidence for institutional investors. Again, this is one of the instruments that has managed to attract pension funds from emerging economies, which again I think is one of these huge opportunities. It also has replicated. So we now have Climate Investor 1 was focused on renewable energy, Climate Investor 2 on water sanitation, and currently there is a work on replicating Climate Investor 3. We're coming to Climate Investor 3 around methane. So I think it's a really good example. But I also mention it because the basic structure, the idea behind it, has helped inform, and we've been helping in that context as well. Here in Indonesia, the SDG1 Indonesia Fund, which again has been inspired at least by that structure out there. So I think simplification and thinking about how can you come up even with blended finance instruments, but that are simpler and really help reduce transaction costs is really important.
I see it. I think that's really a breakthrough from Climate Investor 1, where you say you can reduce transaction costs and you can also bundle like 3 components and make it much more efficient. That's very innovative, really. And also very impressive that through more than 70 innovative instruments, more than $4 billion has been mobilized, really.
Very happy about that. And more to come.
Yes, definitely. Really looking forward to it. So now let's look at the broader picture about underlying macroeconomic conditions. What kind of ideal underlying macroeconomic conditions should Indonesia have to be successful in mobilizing climate finance? What do you think? For example, what role do things like monetary stability or fiscal space or green industrial policy needs to play?
Very important roles. I think maybe let me just emphasize three kind of very important underlying components. I think the first one, and we see that very clearly from experience, is having a deep financial market. I think Indonesia in this context needs to kind of do a little bit more. So the financial market of Indonesia is not that deep. Domestic credit provided by the financial actors is only around 50% of the GDP. If you look at other countries in the region, like the Philippines or Thailand, it's much higher. So I think this is something that is really important, because if you don't have depth of the financial market, then projects that are aiming to accelerate, sustainable or like energy transition or like climate action more broadly, they need to compete in the market, and that's obviously much harder to get actually credits from banks. So deep financial market, I think, is component number one. I think the second one that needs to be accompanied and supported, in addition to the deep financial markets, you need to have enough fiscal space, because again, if particularly the financial sector cannot provide that much, then you need to have more support, like the second engine behind it needs to be the government. And so here, it is about how can you maybe relocate some fiscal spending from non-productive uses towards productive uses, which are the ones that ultimately help you increase an economy's, long-term output and economic growth, which is, for example, infrastructure or innovation technology, but also climate action, in my opinion. So how can you reallocate some of the fiscal spending towards those uses? But I think a second opportunity in that space is also, and we talked a little bit about the shifting early on, from like non-climate investments towards climate investments, so aligning them. I think there's also an opportunity of possibly raising fiscal revenues by looking at activities that have negative externalities, again, fossil fuel, or any activity that emits greenhouse gases. So I think having enough fiscal space is really important. And then the third one, which you might need in any case, but it should be, I think the third component in the space is prudent foreign debt management, because if you don't have sufficient support through both the domestic private and public market or sources, then you need to somehow go towards international sources, and this is where you need to have prudent foreign debt management.
I see. Those are really great insights, Barbara. So, as I remember, so first we need a deep financial market, and then enough fiscal space, and also a prudent foreign debt management. When all these three things are done right, then Indonesia will have a will successfully mobilize climate finance.
And not only development, this is going to be
And
very good for
development.
the country. It's
All
going
right.
to be a good country.
Okay, so I would like to talk a little bit more about political risk then now. So as you know, Indonesia is a democratic country, and how can it maintain its climate commitment whenever there's a new administration, then things change, policies change, regulations change. So how can we maintain all these climate commitments then, and what governance models or institutional safeguards are needed?
Not an easy one, and again, it's these are questions that are being addressed around the world. I think it's something that we all need to work on more. I think my first point is really the voice of the voter. So I think every one of us has a way to express our kind of preference, our priorities, and our support for special candidates. But obviously that means that we need to make sure that the candidates, whether it's the presidential candidates or whatever level you are, need to be discussing climate change. So how can you make sure that climate change is a part of the categories that basically are part of the discussions in debates of the presidential candidates? So how can maybe the general election commissions that are out there make sure that climate change is being added as one of the categories that need to be addressed by presidential candidates, because like that, then you as a voter, I as a voter, we can make a choice based on that. So I think that's probably the first one. I think then there's obviously other, in a democracy, there's always other parts of the government that can help as well. I think here in Indonesia, I think the House of Representatives plays a key role. Need to regularly check how the government is doing compared to vis-a-vis to the goals that have been set, particularly around, in our context here, obviously around climate goals. So I think what I'm seeing here, and again learning here in Indonesia, that think tanks and academia certainly is trying to give that input to the governments, but it's not always very clear that they can also use the House of Representatives to basically, highlight those messages and really make sure that there is more accountability by the government towards the goals that it has set. So, I think just thinking more about how the government actually ultimately answers to people, to the ones who have voted for them, I think is really important. So lots of opportunities, but I think most importantly, we all have a voice, and I think that's something we need to take very seriously.
I see. That's really, really nicely phrased, Barbara. It's a good reminder that it starts also with us from the voting process, who we voted for during the presidential debates, right? Election debates. These are already good opportunities for us to understand what are their priorities, each candidate's priorities, and this will ensure a smooth transition from the previous administration to the next administration on how we want climate to be in which priority in the government, right? Really great. So it's also a good reminder as well that climate change is not just technical, but it's also very political, right? And we really need to follow all the narratives going on. I see. And now I would like to talk a little bit about the region, Indonesia and the region. In your views, in what aspects can Indonesia be a leader in Southeast Asia's climate mitigation and adaptation efforts? Like, could it be in renewable energy or in sustainable finance, or perhaps in adaptations, as we have heard before?
Well, I think it could be a leader in so many areas, but there's some very clear ones. Certainly, we've been talking about small island states, the specific geographic setting of Indonesia, and as Southeast Asia more generally consists of mainland and obviously all the islands. I think Indonesia, with its vast um, basically dominance of the maritime part of Southeast Asia, I think could play a very important role in the blue economy, so like really in blue mitigation adaptation. That's again both mitigation and adaptation, but I think there is a real opportunity for Indonesia to be recognized as a leader and work with the other kind of small island states outside even of Indonesia itself to really kind of draw more attention to the needs in the space. I think a little bit related to the point you made before was around adaptation. Obviously, Indonesia's tropical forests are amongst the key tropical forests in the world, not only in the region. So I think this is another area where Indonesia could easily, be out there. Maybe, this is the year of the Brazil Cup, maybe with Brazil or some other, leading countries to really kind of foster more focus on forestry and land use related to that. So I think that's a second area. But I do want to also come back to energy continues to, while we have seen a lot of increases in climate finance towards energy, we still see a huge potential there. And I think Indonesia has been actually really at the forefront thinking through the Just Energy transition partnership, through thinking about possibly, coal to clean transitions to also kind of continue to take a leadership role in this space. So I think that's something I certainly would also encourage, and where I see a huge opportunity to continue to show and to be really at the leading edge.
No, I'm really impressed. You know really a lot about Indonesia.
Well, you've been training me,
and our
been learning.
opportunities here, right? So yeah, due to our geographic conditions, yes, we do have a lot of potential to lead both in mitigation and adaptation. And then with our tropical forests, as you have said, yes, we do have a lot of potential in the forestry and other land use as well. And of course, energy. Right now, I'm really hoping a lot on this Just Energy Transition Partnership and also the coal to green as well.
Yeah, fully,
Yeah.
I could add.
So finally, let's connect Indonesia to the global conversation. What do you think are the latest global trends in climate finance that you see emerging, such as transition finance, loss and damage funds, or private capital mobilization, or anything else? Something that Indonesia may still be catching up on. And what should Indonesia prioritize to stay aligned with the global movement?
Yeah, and I think we've kind of touched upon some of the issues already throughout the conversation. But I do, again, looking at the figures, and I do love figures, I do see that there is a huge opportunity for Indonesia to further focus on private finance mobilization, further focus on how can you get, both commercial financial institutions beyond some of the agriculture, like, forestry areas where they are a little bit active, but bring them in, institutional investors, funds. So I think private finance mobilization is something that we have seen in other geographies and which I think is a real opportunity still here in the country. I do think also, you talk about transition finance, which I think is really important because we need to make sure that there is clear pathways to slowly transition while really understanding all the needs of all stakeholders at all levels, when you transition, for example, in heavy industry. So I think this is another area where, thinking about developing credible transition plans, expanding some of the very helpful taxonomies that exist already in Indonesia to some of those sectors, I think will really help also Indonesian firms and companies to access those markets. So I think that's probably a second area. And then maybe just a final one, the trend that I see, even though it's maybe still a little bit more talk than a full, trend that we see in execution, but there is a lot of an attempt to bring development and climate action together again. So really mainstream climate into every type of development. So we don't want to always single out just this is climate, this is not climate, but like make sure that it's actually mainstreamed into good economic growth, into good economic development. So I think there's probably something that Indonesia also could help kind of demonstrate in the country itself, that this development and climate action go hand in hand.
Great. I think you phrased that really nicely on how Indonesia can catch up on. All right, so thank you so much for all your insights. I think it has been quite a long conversation with so many topics. We have covered so much from the global landscape, all the finance flow. We talk also about the carbon market, lessons learned from developed countries, and also we talked about political context, mitigation, adaptation. My God, I think we covered so much. And I have learned a lot from you today, and this also shows your really extensive knowledge. And I hope this episode can also bring a lot of insights and perspectives to our listeners and viewers out there. And so once again, thank you so much, Barbara. And it's been really lovely, and I'm really grateful. We're really grateful to have you here.
Thank you so much, Ira. And just to say, Asia is the place to be. This is where the potential is. So thank you for having me. Terima kasih.
Terima kasih. Dankeschön.
Dankeschön.
Nah, teman-teman cendekia iklim, sudah banyak yang kita bicarakan dengan Barbara hari ini ya. Kita belajar bahwa pembiayaan iklim itu tidak hanya mengenai angka atau mekanisme pembiayaan, tapi tentang bagaimana kebijakan, ekonomi, dan juga pembangunan bisa saling terhubung untuk menciptakan masa depan negara yang berkelanjutan. Dari perspektif yang telah diberikan hari ini, juga jelas bahwa Indonesia memiliki potensi yang sangat besar, baik di mitigasi maupun adaptasi. Sebagai negara berkembang, dengan inovasi pembiayaan yang terus bertumbuh, Indonesia juga memiliki potensi besar untuk memimpin di Asia Tenggara. Kita juga belajar bahwa konsistensi kebijakan itu sangatlah penting, juga perlu kondisi makroekonomi yang kuat. Dan inovasi pembiayaan ini bisa menjadi kunci untuk menarik investasi, terutama dari lembaga swasta, untuk mencapai aksi iklim. Semoga obrolan hari ini dapat bermanfaat dan menginspirasi kita semua untuk melihat bahwa pembiayaan iklim ini bukan hanya sebagai tantangan, tapi justru sebagai peluang untuk memperkuat ekonomi dan pembangunan. Terima kasih telah mendengarkan obrolan kita hari ini. Sampai jumpa di episode berikutnya dan salam cendekia iklim.